Okay, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Darien Lamen, and I'll be your moderator today for The Bid, The Bad, and The Ugly, a panel discussion about business improvement districts and the future of downtown Rochester, New York, with a panel of experts and organizers from a number of different cities. And we're really excited to host this event. It's being hosted by the Rochester Bid Education Committee, an ad hoc group formed about a year ago that has dedicated itself to researching and promoting critical conversations around business improvement districts and economic development more generally in Rochester, New York. So we hope that this will be the first in a series of conversations and webinars with experts and organizers in other cities who have a depth of knowledge and lived experience with business improvement districts, which here in Rochester, we're trying to get up to speed and understand exactly what they are. So the overview of today's program, we'll do some quick introductions of our panel and get to some definitions of what a business improvement district is, when and why did bids emerge? And then we'll move to sort of closer to the ground case studies from Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C., and as well as New York City and internationally to think about who has benefited from bids and who has been harmed by bids. And then we want to talk also about what are the alternatives and what kind of city do we need in Rochester, and what inspiration and lessons can we take from other cities that have business improvement districts. So over the course of our webinar today, if you want to put questions in the Q&A, we'll try to get to those as we go over the course of the hour, and maybe have some time at the end to pose those directly to our panelists. So feel free to put in your questions into the Q&A, and we'll try to fold those into our discussion today. And we'll end the session today with some updates and next steps here in Rochester, what we know currently about the state of the proposed business improvement district for downtown Rochester. So I want to introduce our panelists, first of all. We're really, really excited and grateful to them for spending a little bit of their Saturdays with us. From Washington, D.C., we have Howe, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at American University and has done a lot of research on business improvement districts in D.C. They are the founder also of the Remora House Mutual Aid Collective, and we're really grateful that they're here with us today. Thank you, Aaron. We're also joined by Caitlin Day in Portland, Oregon, who is a community researcher and organizer with the Western Regional Advocacy Project, which is a coalition of organizers and experts tackling a range of different issues on the West Coast. And we're really grateful to Caitlin as well for joining us and giving us a little bit of insight into some of the organizing there in Portland. And finally, Dr. Susanna Schaller, who is an associate professor in urban studies at the City College of New York, currently in Germany, but normally in New York City. And we're really grateful to Dr. Schaller for being here with us today. Really helped us understand a lot about business improvement districts through her research and writing. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to X out of the slideshow here. And ask you all to say a little bit about, just to introduce yourselves a little bit further, say a little bit about how you first crossed paths with bids, how it was that you got interested in business improvement districts. And why don't we start with Dr. Schaller? Susanna, could you, thank you for being here again. And yeah, how did you first get interested in this as a research topic? Need you to just unmute.
Sorry, I have to unmute. It's a while ago. I was working at a community development corporation in Washington, D.C. in the late 1990s, early 2000. And one of the proposals for us as a community development corporation was to follow up on kind of the Main Street work that we were doing with a business improvement district. The context at the time was that the city, had been taken over by a fiscal control board. There was a new strategic plan, and bids figured prominently in that. And not just downtown bids, but also neighborhood-based bids. And so I think a lot of us at the organization began to ask questions. Well, what is this? How is it institutionalized? Why is it necessary to have this kind of institution versus the Main Street organization? And so that is how the research began in the late 90s.
And well, let's stay in Washington, D.C. then. And Erin, I assume it was in D.C. that you first crossed paths with business improvement districts. What was that like? Why did you feel like this was something important that you really needed to drill down into and do some research and organizing around?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, everybody, once again. Yeah, so I started my PhD research in 2017. And kind of when I started, I knew I wanted to research, do ethnography with unhoused people. And I was kind of looking at some of the different camps around the city, and I kind of narrowed it down to two. One was in a business improvement district and one wasn't. So one was kind of an old growth gentrification and one was a new build gentrification. And I landed on doing my research in the NOMA bid. NOMA, or North of Massachusetts, started in 2007, was the city's 7th or 8th bid. And yeah, it just seemed like a really interesting area with all the construction going on, the transition of this area, what's an industrial area around Union Station, with a lot of underpasses, and that's where most of the unhoused people live. So with that new build construction going on, millions and millions of dollars of investment and development, and then a growing encampment. And the encampment grew really from 2015 to 2020, when the entire camps were completely eradicated from the NOMA bid. So that's kind of how I got into it. And now with the work I do at Remora House, we're all over the city now, and bids cover a good chunk of the city, and we're constantly in antagonism with them, from the Capital City bid to the Golden Triangle to DuPont Circle.
Thanks, Erin. And finally, Caitlin, how about you? How did you first hear about bids? When did this come on your radar?
Yeah, so I started investigating bids mainly because I was already involved in different organizing projects in Portland. And I started to notice there was this organization called Portland Business Alliance who was doing a lot of lobbying against issues that we were advocating for. So for instance, things like trying to defund police and get less police on our streets. And I also definitely noticed, I spent a lot of time downtown and would notice how there was security guards who were patrolling in public space, which seemed very odd. And I was also working with Western Regional Advocacy Project around issues around homelessness, and our local organizations there, Right to Survive and Sisters of the Road. And I just kind of was like, how is this one organization so powerful and able to make all of these policy decisions? And why is there private security everywhere? And that's when I kind of discovered the framework of what a business improvement district is. And then in Portland, they're called enhanced services districts there. So I kind of teamed up with RAP and started doing public records requests on the ESDs there. And yeah, and that's how I jumped into it.
Thank you all. I want to provide a little bit of context here for how we in Rochester, in the grassroots, first came to know about this proposal for business improvement here in downtown Rochester. Basically, you can see here the proposed footprint of a downtown, quote unquote, Rochester bid. This is from last year. And it encompasses over 1.5 square miles, running from the Genesee Brewery up north along the river, down to the Ford Street Bridge on both sides of the river, as well as the inner loop area of downtown. And this first came onto our radar here in around this time last year. The Rochester Downtown Development Corporation, RDDC, started soliciting window art to quote unquote show what a bid can do. So some artists in the community got wind of this. Throughout the spring, we started doing some of our own research and trying to understand what exactly was a business improvement district. What did they hope to do with art in windows? Who was behind it? And we began to kind of mobilize some around city council meetings to get them to ask some questions and slow this process down. Our understanding from our research is that what really catalyzed this most recent push to create a business improvement district in Rochester was in 2018, the city secured several $millions in state economic development funding to invest in what they were calling the Rock the Riverway initiative to do placemaking work in downtown and a number of strategic sites along the river. And so, that was the catalyst. But as we dug deeper, we discovered that this wasn't the first time that a business improvement district had been attempted in Rochester. The RDDC was also behind a push in 2014 that failed to create a downtown business improvement district. Before that, the RDDC, very closely aligned with the DSS, Downtown Services, created in 1996 an ambassador program, which had locally known as the Red Shirts, who served as kind of unofficial security at events, often off-duty or retired police officers. And before that, in 1989, there was the creation of a downtown enhancement district along Main Street. And so people in Rochester will kind of recognize maybe where the boundaries of that are. Often at holiday times, there are some decorations that go up, and there are some additional city services that are provided there, but it's in a very narrow footprint. And what this most recent push to create a downtown business improvement district would do is really radically expand that. And so, starting in June, we began to mobilize a little bit more to ask more critical questions about what this was, what was being planned. RDDC hired Galen Brooks, who formerly worked for the Downtown DC bid, as the director of the Rochester Downtown Partnership. So this kind of alphabet soup, RDDC, RDP, essentially the same entity and the same players. And then in August of last year, City Council voted 6-3 to authorize them to develop a formal proposal for a downtown bid in Rochester. And so, as I mentioned before, Kelly Cheadle will give us an update at the end of our session today on where that process currently stands and how to get involved and educate ourselves further here in Rochester. So, but before we move on, I did want to kind of take a step back, assuming that some people joining us today might not know very much about a business improvement district, and really just give the kind of nuts and bolts definition and ask Susanna, who has done so much of this legwork for us in her book, Business Improvement Districts and the Contradictions of Placemaking. She's written just a very quick working definition here. Bids are, quote, geographically bounded areas where local property owners can assess themselves or their tenants a fee to solve problems that are negatively impacting the local business environment. Bids do more than just fund supplemental services such as flower plantings and holiday decorations. Susanna goes on to write that bids, quote, redesign large areas of the public realm in our cities and become a powerful voice shaping land use, zoning, transportation, and urban redevelopment planning. So much more than flower boxes. So Susanna, if you could just help us think through what are some of the key features of business improvement districts, like as an institution? How is it different from like a neighborhood association or something like that? Are there one or two things that we should think about when we're trying to understand what is this institutional form, what is a bid?
I have to unmute again. I guess the important thing to really keep in mind with business improvement districts is how they are, because they are enabled by local legislation. What is actually in the legislation, right? And in most cases, as is the case in New York and in Washington, D.C., they are incorporated as nonprofit organizations. So this is why a lot of people kind of think, well, they're just nonprofit organizations. They're there for the public good or to serve at least kind of a community purpose. And then the important question is to ask, well, who sits on the board of these organizations? So in most cases, as is the law in DC, for example, it's 51%, so the majority of the board members have to be property owners or represent kind of a certain amount of this assessed value of property in the district. And they have then the voting voice on these board of directors. And the important other aspect is that they are kind of taxing districts. So they assess properties in the district. Originally, it was to assess mostly commercial properties. It is increasingly also being used to assess, so increasingly also residential properties are assessed in a district. And as you already said by the quotes, is that they, originally the idea was the clean and safe campaigns to ostensibly clean and up certain districts. And there's a whole, history behind that is very problematic. But that was the original, was this kind of clean and safe campaign to provide supplemental, what was said to be supplemental services. And yet, over time, they've really grown to do a lot more than that. And originally, they were already doing that because they were involved in discussions around zoning and land use, for example.
Is it fair to say that business improvement is often a bit of a misnomer because of the outsized influence property owners have structurally in these? Isn't it more about real estate development and improving the valorization of real estate? And does that create some tension with business owners or certain types of business owners?
Yeah, so a kind of the policy language sometimes creates these contradictions or misunderstandings, in that when we think about a business improvement districts, oftentimes the policy language is around helping small business. And yet, as we just said, is that really the assessment is placed on the properties. Property owners can make the decisions. Now, the real contradiction is actually that oftentimes the assessments are passed down to the small businesses through their leases. So they are then paying both the assessment, their lease, and potentially, because that's also often incorporated into leases, increase in property taxes as property values increase. The other thing to look out for is how the assessment formulas are designed, because depending on how assessment formula, if they are, for example, designed around notions of assessed value, that means if the assessed value in a district increases, the budget will also increase of the bid. So there's a built-in incentive to also increase property values. Given that it is property owners who are sitting on the board, there's also conflict of interest that you could imagine between perhaps the tenants who are in the businesses who are paying the leases and property owners who are interested in improving, revalorizing their property.
Thank you for that. I wanted to also ask you about what you call in your book bid urbanism. I think this is, for me, one of the things that I found extremely helpful in thinking about bids. They're not just a neutral governance or economic development tool. They exist within a kind of ideological and historical framework that you really draw out in your book, specific to DC, but I think applies kind of generally throughout the United States. So I wanted to ask you about this. You say in your book, to be clear, I do not argue that single bids are responsible for gentrification, but I do advance the case that bid urbanism is. And then you go on to say, bid urbanism is especially about urban placemaking to revalorize the dense, walkable city. And before I kind of ask you to explain a little bit more what you mean there, I also wanted to just kind of situate this conversation within a historical moment in which bids kind of come onto the scene in the 1970s, but really gain steam in the 80s and 90s in a moment where we can call it roughly neoliberalism. Aaron, you've written about this as well. And, I don't want to get too technical or in the weeds about what that is, but I think in broad strokes, we can say that it's characterized by the privatization of public space, disinvestment in social welfare, and the complement to that, an increased public investment in incarceration, criminalization, and we see the 90s as really a key moment for this with Bill Clinton on the federal level. And so I guess my question, Susanna, is can you do a little bit of this this historical framing for us, how bids and bid urbanism relate to this historical moment in which they emerge? And they're really about not just business improvement, but also a kind of form of government, or rather city governance, in a moment after white flight and disinvestment from the city centers, and this attempt to kind of turn the tide and really put a lot of power in the hands of business owners, capital, finance, etc. Can you kind of give us the potted history of bids?
Okay, that's a lot to do, but I mean, I think you already situated it very, very, very clearly. And just to go back to the city of Washington D.C., right? So D.C. If you're looking, especially in the 1970s, it's a majority Black city. It's just gotten a Black mayor who was elected after a long time of non-democratic election of municipal government until actually 1973, 1978, right? Marion Barry is elected. So you have a city that has been segregated through the use of restrictive covenants, and then, as you already mentioned, redlining, white flight, then middle class flight. So, continuing into the 80s. In DC, you have a fairly progressive or municipal government where there were attempts in the 1980s to already establish a bid, and then specifically in the early 1990s. And those legislations did not pass, so they failed twice in the city council. What is then particular is that you have a fiscal control board in the late 1990s. And as I was kind of mentioning before, is with it the drawing up of a strategic plan that is really focused on drawing reinvestment capital into the city. And part of that, in terms of the governance, is then to move toward a public-private partnership regime in which business improvement districts play an important part. But it's not only bids, it's also other financing tools. So you'd have tax increment financing tools, other tools that overlay with the bids that draw in capital and ensure kind of that redevelopment can happen much more efficiently. And bids are an important actor in that because they can, they can function as organizations that reposition certain districts in the urban geography from a real estate perspective, and to manage that growth. So if you look at DC, since the bid law did not pass until after the Fiscal Control Board came in and there was a change in the city council. There was legislation that then allowed the TIF districts, for example, the tax increment financing districts, and together this set the groundwork for drawing capital back in to the city. And as I said, the clean and safe campaigns, as you kind of already were mentioning, were used to make the city feel familiar and safe for populations who, had a racialized perspective of the city at the time. So, the whole trope of urban, Black, and dangerous and all of that the media had disseminated was trying to be, the bids were trying to counter that image. So it has these very specifically also racist roots in that sense.
Thank you for that. I know that was a tall task to sum up 40, 50 years of history and political economics, but that is very helpful. And I'm sure that Rochester listeners will be able to draw a lot of parallels with that trajectory. I want to just get Aaron's, Aaron, if you want to add anything to that. I know you've thought a lot about this as well, before we go to Portland and hear about that particular case study. Aaron, you recently wrote in your brand new academic article, "The City and the City Tent Camps and Luxury Development in the NOMA Business Improvement District in Washington, D.C. You write, "Public space has become a primary battleground in the neoliberal era. Bids attempt to reimagine public space to condition the types of peoples and actions that occur there, creating sanitized spaces to attract global flows of capital." So that's essentially what Susanna was talking about. Do you want to add anything to that from your own research and perspective about how that kind of plays out?
Yeah, I just like one thing I would like to kind of reiterate from what Susanna said is that bids in DC started through a hostile takeover of the federal government. Our city said no twice. And then all of a sudden our fiscal control board, our finances get taken over by the federal government, and then we get bids legalized. A lot of people didn't want them. And yeah, so then just a little bit more context with the public space thing. With that disinvestment of welfare spending and social spending comes disinvestment in things like trash removal, security, public space enhancement, less and less art in downtown areas, and this has been privatized. And I can talk a little bit more about this later, about how some of the on-the-ground ways of this worked, specifically in the NOMA bid. But yeah, I think Susanna's overview is great, and we'll just add that.
Great, thank you both for that view from Washington, D.C. Caitlin, I want to turn to you and ask you if you could just kind of give us the overview of bids in Portland. I understand there are 3. They cover over 500 blocks and have an annual combined revenue of about $8 million. What have they been using that money for? And what, just kind of as an introduction to the landscape there, what should we know about how they operate?
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, our bids here are called enhanced services districts. So if you hear me say ESDs, that's what that's all about. But yeah, we have 3 of them. I think the one that I'll focus on the most is our downtown bid, which is called Clean and Safe. So speaking of the Clean and Safe campaigns, they just named our bid Clean and Safe. So yeah, Clean and Safe is like 218 blocks. It takes up downtown and Old Town, which Old Town in Portland is probably the area where we have like the highest concentration of unhoused people living. It's a lot of where our social services are concentrated. So that's part of the reason we have a bid there in the first place, is because there is a push to try to clean up Old Town. So yeah, Clean and Safe has existed since 1988. And our other two bids, we have the Lloyd District, which started in 2001. And the most recent bid is the Central East Side, which started in 2019. And I can talk about that one a bit later, because that one is what they call a reformed bid, because we pushed back against the creation of it. And they made some reforms, but they weren't great. They were very superficial. So anyways, yeah, so the majority of the funds that bids in Portland use is for private security. And I really want to emphasize that the relationship, what bids do is they allow private security to patrol in public space. Normally, private security can only patrol on public property, on private property. So that's something that's pretty significant about how bids operate, is it allows for that. But another thing that happens in Portland is our downtown bid, Clean and Safe, also has a contract with Portland Police Bureau. And so we have 4 Portland police officers whose salaries are paid by Clean and Safe. And as a result, they only patrol within the Clean and Safe district. So that's also a very weird relationship they have. They also historically have had contracts with the district attorney's office. They used to help run a community court. And so when people went through the community court, they would be assigned to do community service, which was basically like cleaning up the streets within the business improvement district. And yeah, they also do street cleaning programs, which you'll hear about that a lot with bids. They usually call them like homeless to work programs. So they're usually like job training programs where they hire either formerly unhoused or currently unhoused people to do street cleaning. They can be very exploitative programs because they paint them as if they're job training programs. And so usually they're short term, and they also don't usually receive the benefits that people would if this were actually a city function and allowed for people to have unions. And so it's also like very exploitative. And there are city documents where the city has admitted that they like this program because it allows them to pay people below living wage and to really cut costs down on what would otherwise put a dent into the city budget. So that's really what they do. And then lastly, the other thing I really wanted to bring up is our bids also do a lot of lobbying. In particular, our downtown bid, I mentioned it earlier, but there's an organization called the Portland Business Alliance. They manage our downtown bid. And what's really unique about this is Portland Business Alliance is also the Chamber of Commerce. Portland Business Alliance actually started as a merger between the bid and the Portland Chamber of Commerce. So they kind of morphed together. So now we have some of our bid revenue going towards our Chamber of Commerce and paying the salaries of the lobbyists that they hire, who are then lobbying to the city. And a lot of the things they're lobbying for is more policing, more laws that criminalize homelessness. And Portland Business Alliance is easily considered the most powerful lobbying entity in Portland. If you ask anyone who's done any kind of activism in Portland, they've probably come up against Portland Business Alliance. So yeah, bids have done a lot to really shape the politics of the city and increase policing and criminalization of homelessness. So briefly, that's all they've done. There's so much more I could get into, but I'll end it there for now.
Thank you so much for that. I definitely want to ask you a little later on about the organized pushback to the Clean and Safe Enhanced Services District there, since maybe it provides a model of coalitional work that can at least call the question, what are the conflicts of interest here? In Portland, the city's own auditor found that the city was basically derelict in its duty to provide oversight of the bid. And so, I think there's a lot more that we can learn there. And for listeners who haven't been to the WRAPhome.org website, the Western Regional Advocacy Project, there's a ton of very well-researched policy papers, position statements that people can read about all the things that Caitlin has been describing. I wanted to kind of tie this back, Aaron, to your work with unhoused people in Washington, D.C., and pick up on one thing that Caitlin mentioned. Let me just share a screen here, which is the way that business improvement districts often frame themselves as, friends of unhoused people, and kind of have offer a number of different things that I think will, as our viewers will see, stand in some contradiction with other aspects of their operation with regards to unhoused people. So here on the DC Bid Council's website, and Washington, D.C. has 11 business improvement districts. The Bid Council writes that for over 20 years, DC bids have deeply invested in homeless outreach, working with government and provider partners to support people experiencing homelessness, connecting them to housing. Most recently, the downtown DC bid partnered with the DC government to open a state-of-the-art downtown daytime services center that offers a range of resources, etc. Then let's juxtapose that with this image, which is from your article, which was published on Western Regional Advocacy Project's website just yesterday, I believe. And the title of your article is "The Light Art of Displacement, the NOMA Bid Lobbies to Remove Encampments from Its Underpasses." So I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about that. I mean, how do you square the way that bids, talk about all the services, all the social services they invest in, with this politics of sweeping and displacement, and this language of clean and safe, right? How do you square that? Is this kind of like a carrot and stick kind of strategy?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. And it's a great between the NOMA bid and the downtown DC bid. The NOMA bid in DC right now is known as like the most aggressive anti-homeless bid, at least in DC, probably regionally, probably in the US. They have done some very awful tactics. And the downtown DC bid, on the other hand, gets a lot of praise specifically for the downtown or the day center, which I work with a lot of unhoused people. Day centers are great. They're great spaces for people to go, wash their clothing, just hang out, and get some internet, whatever. So once again, that's a great thing, but we also have a lot of issues with the downtown DC bid. They invest a lot of money in anti-homeless architecture. They privatized one of the biggest green spaces in DC, privatized security now, and don't even let unhoused people sit there. Unhoused people used to live there.
What is the architecture? Can you just kind of describe for listeners what an example of that might be?
Yeah, so mainly what the downtown DC bid is doing, so anti-homeless architecture writ large is any type of architecture that doesn't allow unhoused people to set up a tent, lay down, or just be there. The most famous example is the benches in the middle, or the bars in the middle of benches. Obviously, the downtown DC bid does that. Those are everywhere in DC. But what the downtown DC bid does, in addition to that, is add spikes to all their landscaping, and then puts these massive planters, which they don't even put flowers in. It's really annoying. They're just planters with dirt in them, where encampments used to be. So that's kind of a good segue into what happened in the NOMA bid. Right.
As you're speaking, I'll just pull up your image again, and maybe you can just tell us what that is we're looking at.
Cool. So these signs in the image are from the homeless encampment engagements, what DC calls the cleanups or sweeps. These are conducted by the district government, not the bid. So each one represents a different cleanup. These are just from a few of them that happened in 2018, but there's hundreds of them that happened in NOMA. NOMA is has the highest ratio of encampment engagements or cleanups in the city. So what this article is about, and kind of what my research has really centered on, is how the NOMA bid successfully lobbied the district government to remove the biggest encampments in the city from its underpasses. So this kind of all started. So the NOMA bid is a 501c6, which is a business association nonprofit. In 2014, they started the NOMA Parks Foundation, which is a 501c3, a charity nonprofit. And they did this to be able to get federal or city money and make it tax deductible. So in 2015, they got a $50 million grant, $50 million for parks and recreation. And they instantly went to work to use this to make anti-homeless architecture in their own spaces. So originally what they did was, or in 2018, they started building this light art. It cost $2.5 million, and it's in 2 separate underpasses in NOMA, where unhoused people used to live. So in 2018, they did that, temporarily displacing people from the underpasses. This is one of the light art. It doesn't look that cool in person. The upkeep is really poor. It doesn't look great. It doesn't provide much light. And it cost $2.5 million. Too much for that. And they were not built by local artists. They were built by people in Amsterdam and San Francisco. So in 2018, after they built this light art, had a few like failed promotional events because the encampments didn't go away. They just were template. You can see here with the sidewalk closed, they temporarily displaced them. But between 2018 and 2019, the encampments in NOMA grew from about 25 tents to over 80. So massively grew. And there's 3 main underpasses where people would set up tents. And then in 2019, the NOMA bid wrote open letter, just kind of an open letter to their own residents and property owners, and sending it to the district government, the mayor, and the Department of Health and Human Services, requesting that they increase criminalization in the area. And one of the main policy shifts or policy changes they requested was the creation of a pedestrian safe passage zone, which was essentially a no tent zone in the underpasses, citing the fact that people with strollers couldn't go by, people in wheelchairs, which wasn't true. So then in January 2020, so the open letter was written in August 2019. So just a few months later, in January 2020, the district government responded to the NOMA bid and created a pedestrian passageway. And I want you to note that very similar language between a pedestrian safe passage zone that the NOMA bid requested and the pedestrian passageway that the DC government enacted months later, making one of the underpasses a no tent zone, which by 2021 spread to the other underpasses as well, effectively displacing over 100 people over the course of a year. So this really shows how the power of the NOMA bid to lobby the district government for these policies. And in that open letter, they initiated a complaint-oriented policing campaign. They had residents and property owners write letters to the mayor and the government officials asking them to do something about this. And in the end, they were successful. And all of the people I worked with during my research are now no longer in those areas. And they replaced what they did to make sure the encampments couldn't come back was put these huge, ugly concrete barriers, like Jersey barriers, if you know what those are, in these underpasses that actually make less of a pedestrian passageway than the tents. So they actually make it harder for people to use these spaces.
So as we kind of shift back over to the West Coast, I wanted to bring in a survey that was conducted by UC Berkeley's law school a few years ago, in which they surveyed bids in 96 California cities and found that 90% of them coordinated closely with police. And the thing I wanted to draw out here from what Aaron is saying, this study found that, quote, bid involvement in social services is experienced by homeless people as an additional form of policing, surveillance, and harassment. So I think, one thing that we've seen in this kind of initial push here in Rochester to promote a business improvement district is a much more careful discourse, not clean and safe, but community, right? Sensitivity to the unhoused population. So, the discourse has definitely shifted, but I think maybe what we see in NOMA and in Portland is that, I think one has to judge a bid on the basis of what it does and not what it says. So Caitlin, as we kind of go back to the West Coast, I wanted to ask you about the End Clean and Safe Coalition that formed in 2020, I believe, or around then, to try to take advantage of a really important moment where the Clean and Safe Enhanced Services District's contract was basically up for renewal, and you all had a kind of window to organize and really raise some questions. This coalition, I understand, included RAP, but also the ACLU of Oregon, Portland DSA, and others. So how do you assess the success of that push? And ultimately, you can talk about this, but ultimately City Council did vote to extend that contract by 5 years instead of 10. So I don't know if that's a victory. Sounds like maybe there were some concessions made. How do you assess the effectiveness and success of that organizing initiative and where things kind of currently stand in Portland?
Yeah, so like I was saying, Clean and Safe is our downtown ESD or bid. And a little background before I get into how that campaign happened. So you mentioned earlier the audit that happened here. So that actually happened because with RAP, we did a bunch of public records requests to the city to try and get more information about the ESDs here. And that whole process led us to a bunch of roadblocks. Basically, all of the bureaus we were requesting documents from were either saying that they didn't have the documents or they would deny our request. And we kind of had a back and forth with the city. And it turned out at the end of it that most of the documents we were requesting were things that the city didn't even have. So this was things like board meeting minutes, contracts, all of the subcontracts that the ESDs have, annual reports, audits, all that kind of stuff. So we went to the auditor's office and we were like, hey, all of this information is missing. It sounds like you're doing no oversight. And the auditor's office, the staffers we talked to didn't even know what an ESD was. Like, that's how kind of technical they are. And so that's what prompted them to do the audit. And so we used that audit as kind of a jumping off point because it really just like confirmed a lot of things we were already saying. But at least for now, we had like a legitimate city document that was like, yeah, these districts don't do any oversight. And so that's kind of the jumping off point we used to really go into this contract renewal. So the ESDs here, their contracts are actually renewed every 10 years, which is pretty ridiculous. And so the last time that Clean and Safe had a contract renewal was in 2011, and 2021 was the last contract renewal. And we were like, well, we have this audit now and we can really build up some steam for this. So yeah, I would say the big successes we had in that campaign was we were able to really like get a very coordinated media strategy to really try to expose what bids were. Just by some miracle, we had a local journalist here who had written for Teen Vogue before. And so he was like, hey, I want to write an article about bids and specifically focused on Portland, and I'm going to pitch it to Teen Vogue. And so we got this like amazing article about the harms of bids in Teen Vogue, which was a pretty big slap in the face to our bids here. They're like, oh, that doesn't look good. But also like at the beginning of the year, there was a board member on Clean and Safe who was like, hey, I don't like this financial relationship where the money that's supposed to be going into this bid is paying for the salaries of Portland Business Alliance who are doing this lobbying. that's not really helping us in the bid. So we were able to use that. And that was something that like a lot of people got angry about. We also like formed a relationship with condo owners who were like, I don't want to pay into this. It's supposed to be benefiting business owners. I don't even like the services that they provide. So we actually like had a pretty robust coalition of people who opposed the bid, which was great because in the past, I think we've often just been written off as like a bunch of radicals who are just angry. And this time we were able to say like, no, it's not just us. People who don't even like align with us politically are also saying like, we don't want this bid. So that was kind of how that happened. And we were able to open up public listening sessions before the contract was renewed. That's never happened before. Usually it just goes to city council and they vote on it. We were able to push the city and be like, no, we need like a series of public listening sessions on this. So that happened, but yeah, ultimately, unfortunately, the contract was just renewed again. They made the most basic reforms, which was they created like a community health outreach worker program, which we also just found out is contracting with this place called Bybee Lakes, which is the shelter that's a former jail that no one wanted turned into a shelter in the first place. It's like the highest barrier shelter in the city now. So that's who they contracted with. And so that's very problematic. And they are saying that they responded to the community. But yeah, unfortunately, just with all the power that Portland Business Alliance has, they were able to really lobby behind closed doors to just get the contract renewed. And yeah, it was difficult, but I think now more than any time in history, people in Portland are more aware of like what an enhanced services district is and the harms that they cause, which I think was the most successful thing that came out of that. Is now people are paying attention a lot more. And before they were able to really just do their business and no one paid attention. No one said anything. So yeah, that's how that contract renewal process happened. And now we're in the process of our audit response, which has been stalled, which is a whole thing. So I'll kind of end it here for now.
Thank you. That's super informative. And super inspiring to see this question, these issues get more mainstream attention. You mentioned the difficulty of placing stories about these kinds of things in the media. We can link to that Teen Vogue article on the No Bid Rock website if people haven't already read it, very thoroughly researched. But we also have found that trying to get any kind of critical conversation or attention paid to the bid question in Rochester has also been very difficult, which is one of the things that led us to organize this conversation. So again, we're very grateful to all of you. We're going to start kind of winding down this section of our webinar. One of the questions that I had for you, for all of you who are engaged in organizing and mutual aid efforts is, what are the alternatives to business improvement districts? What are the alternatives to bid urbanism? How do your activities in the community kind of speak to another possible city, right? I think there's probably consensus here that we definitely need certain kinds of development, social development, human development in our cities. And so what are the initiatives? I'm thinking, Aaron, maybe you could start here by talking about Remora House and kind of what inspired you to start that. What does mutual aid, what kind of urbanism does mutual aid speak to? What vision of the city have you and the people you work with? What vision of the city animates that initiative and animates you?
Cool. Yeah. Awesome. Great question. Before I answer that, I just want to say two quick things that I just missed saying before. One is about Galen Brooks, who is on the Rochester bid. She was actually the NOMA BID's Planning and Economic Development coordinator when the rain and light weave and the displacement of unhoused people and the open letter. So that is who is now in Rochester. That's actually very scary to me. And then secondly, that one thing that hasn't been talked about, and this is true with bids across the board, the creation of bids is linked to the loss of affordable housing and the loss of long time in DC, primarily Black businesses. So I just want to note that that's another loss you get from bids. So now Remora House. Remora House really kind of stemmed from my research when COVID started. My research ended in March 2020. So I was actually lucky to not have to deal with COVID. But then all of a sudden, all these people I worked with for a year are now in the direct line of fire at high risk of COVID. And we started getting hand sanitizer, masks, et cetera, to unhoused people, mainly in NOMA to start. And yeah, what type of urbanism is mutual aid is a really interesting question. I don't even know how to like wrap my head around that, but I can say like what it isn't, and it isn't, you know, responding to the needs of wealthy property owners and developers, but rather responding to the needs of everyday people and unhoused people. And something that's really important is that what bids are trying to do with homelessness is try to get people out of their spaces. That's what the day center is about. That's what the concrete barriers are about. That's what the private security is about, is to get people out of their borders, out of sight, out of mind. That all costs money. And we could be investing that money into housing and into better sheltering services. Like Caitlin was saying, the bid is partnering in Portland with this awful shelter that people logically don't want to use. A lot of people don't want to use shelters for various reasons. And the downtown DC bid was smart, right? They did a day center. A lot of unhoused people love that, and that's great. But there's other ways to do that that don't have to come with the concrete barriers, the too expensive art. We should invest in other art. We should invest in local art. So all of those things are, you know, wrapped into mutual aid in a smaller scale, right? Because there's not as many of us doing that. We don't have the resources, but we're the people on the ground. We're the people talking to people. And if we just like redirect our energy to actually doing the things that we want and need without, you know, having to respond to the very wealthy property owners in particular, we could do a lot more. I'm not exactly sure if that answers that question, but yeah.
I think it does. And Susanna, I wanted to pose you this question too, since you have, you know, such a broad and deep knowledge of, you know, from urban studies. I think in your book you cite feminist urban studies and thinking about, you know, the way in which when we think about economic development in cities now, people are thinking about creating new things, innovating, building new buildings versus, you know, those who have talked about infrastructures of care, right? What are the spaces and places in cities where people can get daycare, can get different types of care, and how is it that those never seem to be priorities for investment? So I know that within urban studies, you know, there's a whole kind of panorama of other urbanisms and forms of thinking about the city to draw on. What is your thought about what's useful to think about in terms of imagining an alternative to bid urbanism?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's very broad. And I also wanted to just get back to, maybe even go back to DC, because we can also go back and just see like what opportunities were foreclosed, right? So in response to urban renewal and kind of urban renewal planning and destruction of neighborhoods in DC and is in neighborhoods across the country, people did organize and they demanded more participation in planning of their neighborhoods. And if you, look at DC or look at New York, the community boards, or in DC, the advisory neighborhood commissions, they were originally more envisioned as being the local democratic institution with resources, and that's the problem, is with resources to actually, one, envision a different kind of neighborhood, and then multiple different neighborhoods, right? But from a local perspective. But you need to have the resources to do the planning. You need to have the resources to invest in your neighborhood. And then if you counter or juxtapose that to what happened to the advisory neighborhood commissions, which actually became more advisory bodies with not a lot of power, and then the creation of business improvement districts, which essentially privatize urban governance on the neighborhood level to property owners, right? So you might think of it as de-democratizing what our urban planning might look like. So I'm thinking there are ways even to look and see where were opportunities foreclosed. There's lots of people who organized around that, who are also still around, and who have a lot to say about that. So I think that's one aspect. I think another aspect that is interesting, if we're because you're asking to kind of speculate around what another different kind of city might look like. Another aspect is kind of how do we rethink redevelopment and for example, if a city has public owns property, right? How does that get reprivatized to people who might develop it in the form of cooperatives, instead of having, as in New York, when you have large areas, for example, that might be ripe for development, where land is turned over to a single developer. And there are models for that. And, I've looked at one model in Tübingen in Germany, which is very, very interesting because they did a participatory planning around what we might call a brownfield, but it was former military barracks that were abandoned in the 1990s. And then the kind of planning processes that happened and the formation of building groups, cooperative building groups, and the privatization of smaller lots on that larger public land, area that was publicly owned. So those are kind of two different ways. It's really to think about what do we do with our land base, like who should own it, how should it be owned? And the other question is, again, the governance. How do we institutionalize governance, and what do we think democracy is, and who should have a voice in our local governance kind of organizations?
Thank you so much. And thank you for taking my kind of speculative philosophical question and turning it to something very concrete. Like, we don't have to invent something. We can look to the opportunities in the institutions that were foreclosed, as you said. So we are at about an hour so far. I want to respect all of your time. There are a lot of really great questions in the Q&A. I don't know if the panelists have been able to monitor those. I think what I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, is just pull a couple of those out, and then we'll bring Kelly on to talk about next steps here in Rochester and what we know about where this process is here. There's one question, Susanna, that I think probably you could speak to. Can someone talk about the relationship between the International Downtown Association and local ordinances that criminalized unhoused folks? And maybe, I think just generally, what is the International Downtown Association? And, I think that will give us a sense of the global scope of ambition of the folks and just how well organized this network of urban planners and other folks are. Susanna, can you speak to the IDA, what that is? And I don't know if you can speak specifically to.
I can't specifically speak to the ordinances. Maybe one of the other panelists can do that. The International Downtown Association is as you were saying, it's an international organization, membership organization of their consultants, planners, business owners, property owners, developers, all kinds of. But what they have been their headquarters went to DC in 1978. I think I'm getting the date right, the year right. And we're also, if you look at the transcripts of the bid enabling legislation, they testify, they lobby around business improvement districts. There's also international conferences. So bids are an international diffusing model. So it's not, and I think there was a question about, there's so many different kinds of bids. And that is true. So I think that goes back to the comment that I made before. It's really important to look at the enabling legislation and to see what's in the law. So to see the kind of work that they propose to do and who has control over or voting power over decision-making. That's very important, and how they are funded. So that's a very important comment. Again, the IDA, they also do, they look at best practices. So some of the placemaking and experiential urbanism is not necessarily bad. It just depends on who is benefited and who benefits. Like Aaron was saying earlier, really focusing on funding local arts organizations rather than bringing international artists in might be a very positive role to play. So there are different ways, but that's the IDA. I don't know if you all can speak to the specific questions around.
I can speak a little bit about like the homeless ordinances. So something that's very common. So the International Downtown Association has a yearly conference where they all meet and they have like different panel discussions. Almost always there's panel discussions about what to do about homelessness. And that is where a lot of people from different bids are able to come together and be like, here's what we're doing in our city. And they're able to share these different ordinances that they're drafting there and share ideas. The last conference was in September, I think, and our downtown bid attended that conference, and they actually sent a newsletter out afterwards, and they're like, we just got back from the International Downtown Association, and the #1 topic of discussion was homelessness. So they really are just coming together and sharing best practices, like Susanna said. And yeah, they really are modeling off of one another. And I also think like something I've noticed with bids too is a lot of people who work at bids, they go on to work at different bids. Like people are traveling around a lot. And so that's why I think it's great to have things like this where people from different cities are coming together to talk about our bids, because that's what the bids are doing with each other. And the International Downtown Association is one of the ways they're doing that. But they also contract with firms like Block by Block, who also help create, enabling legislation to create bids. So yeah, they're communicating, so we might as well communicate.
Yeah, I wanted to add something to that too, and that's kind of where I'm saying the bid urbanism is that it's not just about the local bids or one local bid. It is about an application of a model for urban governance and or one form of urban revitalization that is really focused on or what we're seeing is gentrification through that model, right? So, and so often like in DC or in New York, you have the local bids, then you have the bid councils, and then you obviously have the International Downtown Association. So as Caitlin was saying, there is this conversation that spans the local to the international, and which is, and then with public sector funding. That's also the other thing in terms of thinking through this, is that they were originally sold as self-sustaining models, and they are increasingly pulling in public funds as well. So that is a contradiction, because it does potentially take funds away from other services that we could provide. So that's also something to investigate when these are all the questions I think people, that are maybe important to ask. It's like, what's the funding? What kind of public funding are they taking in? How are they organize, these kind of things.
Thank you both for that. Erin, did you want to add anything, or were there any questions in the Q&A that you wanted to pull out and respond to?
Not really, that covered it. The big one I wanted to respond to was, right, it's not just about DC, and like the Berkeley Law report you brought up earlier, they studied, I forget how many cities in California, but found each and every one of them to have negative issues surrounding either anti-homeless lobbying or actual criminalization. And obviously there are worse bids and maybe better bids, but like other people said, it's about the bid urbanism and what they do writ large, and that's always going to be their goal. And then just the one other question about Galen Brooks, her role as the planning and economic director of the NOMA bid up until 2019, she was directly in charge of the placemaking stuff. So that includes the mural art, the light art installations, and the lobbying done in the open letter. So just to reiterate, that is now who that ideas and that planning and economic model has moved to Rochester. So just re-highlighting that.
All right, thank you. So I think one of the takeaways here for me, or one of the things that I think is probably useful to inject in our local conversation, is when we hear people say not all bids, right? We can say, okay, fair enough. Let's wait and see what's in this district plan, which we expect to see pretty soon in the next couple of months. We expect RDDC, RDP to come up with their formal proposal for exactly who's in and who's out, what the governance structure will be, all that sort of thing. All right, let's wait and see. But in the meantime, we know who the players are. We already know who they are. They're the same players who are constantly at the table when it comes to talking about economic development. And so, we can have another conversation about their role and legacy in this community, and I think we probably should. Maybe Kelly will get into some of that in talking about next steps and what to expect. But I think what I take away is it's not just about the bid. The bid is also not just a kind of neutral tool. It is a tool in the hands of people who share a kind of similar philosophy on economic development, and it's a tool that emerged in a specific moment when there was structural disinvestment at a national and even international level, right? In social services, in downtown areas, in the commons or the public, or however you want to phrase that. So, I think we already do know quite a lot about how bids will likely play out in the hands of Rochester's power brokers. So anyway, not to put too fine of a point on it. But at this point, I'd like to introduce Kelly Cheadle, who is an artist and organizer here in Rochester and has done a ton of work researching, educating this community, and organizing and promoting this event today. So Kelly is going to update us on where that process for proposing a bid is at in Rochester, and just give us some next steps. So Kelly, take it away.
Excuse me. Of course, I have to cough right as the camera goes on. I just want to say thank you all for being here. I really wanted to have this discussion before that first vote went through, but here we are. So I'm going to do my best to give you a short recap on how we got here, what we've learned from our speakers, and about bids in other cities. So in summary, we've seen that bids use the arts to surreptitiously push gentrification and privatization. We've learned that bids often target unhoused people and privatize public space. They undermine local democracy and take power away from elected officials. They further empower the most powerful folks while increasing inequality. In Rochester, the RDDC/RDP are using the same playbook and even some of the same staff from other problematic bids mentioned today, and many of us are deeply concerned. So the Rochester Downtown Development Corporation, also known as the RDDC, is a nonprofit whose sole mission is to drive downtown development. They get a lot of money to do these things because, excuse me, to do things to increase They get a lot of money to do things to increase development and raise property values. I'm saying this because it's important that you know that the RDDC is not an arts organization. Last spring, the RDDC put out an unfortunate art call. It happens. So a group of us from Rock Arts United, a local nonprofit that is centered in supporting cultural equity, as well as the smaller arts orgs and individual artists here in Rochester, reached out in an effort to help improve the call and ensure that artists would be paid appropriately for their labor. And we wanted to learn more about the sizable funding that was somehow connected to it, because again, the RDDC is not an arts organization. In that process, we learned that the RDDC had received millions of dollars through the Rochester Downtown Partnership and Rock the Riverway and Rock 2025. We were told that these funds were used to show the community what a bid could do, and were reassured that the RDDC was not an arts organization. Let's just say for brevity, after a series of unfortunate events, it was clear that our intents did not align, and this actually turns out to be a bit of a blessing. Because as Darien pointed out, a few of us started doing some more digging, and we learned more about these so-called business improvement districts from many of the folks that you've seen here today and more. And we found that many progressive communities are trying to undo the harm caused by bids. And we also learned that bids are often used for art watching or using the arts for arts washing. While we are proud of the fact that arts are part of the creative economy, economic development should not be driving art. And say it with me, the RDDC is not an arts organization. We've seen bid proponents offering the bid as a solution for solving the homelessness downtown. The sole mission of the RDDC is to drive downtown development. The RDDC is not a provider of social services. The new CEO of the RDDC in Rochester was involved in the anti-homeless LED art installation called Rain in Washington, D.C. that Aaron just mentioned. We have good organizations doing work that support unhoused folks that just needs to be supported, not co-opted. It's been over 6 months since the mayor's request to start the creation of a bid was approved by City Council. This summer, over 700 people signed a petition voicing concerns over art washing and the creation of a bid, and a downtown survey where we even had volunteers doing door-to-door outreach to small businesses. That survey showed that 98% of them thought that the community did not have enough information for council to start the process of creating a bid. Unfortunately, City Council approved number 255. It was approved by all but 3 council members. So thank you, council members Stanley Martin, Kim Smith, and Council Vice President Mary Lupian for voting no in the interest of giving the community more time. Now, it should be noted that Mary's vote was a rejection of how the vote was handled that evening and not a rejection of the bid itself. Council advocated for transparency and wanted to hear from more voices in the community. Unfortunately, they felt that starting the process was the way to do that. The RDDC has been behind a push for a bid since 2011. The RDDC has described a bid as a means of having more control over downtown as administrations, who are our elected officials, when they change. The greater Rochester community and the government rejected a bid in 2014. Our community still hasn't heard an answer from the developers to this simple question: what problem is a bid going to solve? Downtown has developed and transformed dramatically without a bid. Community feedback gathered during Rock the Riverway 2017 showed that people wanted more programming and they wanted maintenance of public spaces. With economic development interests having an outsized role in the Rock the Riverway board, the rejected bid effort is back again. The RDDC recently released several promotional videos they called Local Voices, but those voices are either board members from the RDDC or the RDP or aligned interests. And a few of those articles out there with quotes from people in support of the bid also don't identify their affiliation and direct connection to the project. That is not transparency. As we've seen in other cities, the RDDC is presenting itself as if it were an official arm of the city of Rochester. The RDDC is not an official arm of the city of Rochester. And all I keep thinking about is they have $5 million. Do you know what we could do with this community with $5 million? How much programming we could already be providing? This is why we need to make sure that advisory boards, like the one for Rock the Riverway that started this, represent more diverse needs and solutions in our community. The voices of folks who are not in the room must remain centered and cannot be leveraged for gain. Tyler, do you mind sharing that screen? Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that people had the chance to see the steps of where we are in the bid. So steps 6 through 9 are targeted for between January and July of next year. For those of you who target local politics, the ROC bid is now officially a campaign issue. There are 4 seats that are up for election right now, and they could determine the outcome of this bid. We've heard so many troubling issues resulting from the essential structures of the bid. The community was not able to provide provide informed consent for council to begin this vote because they didn't have enough information. But we're now being told that every city has one and we need a bid. We've seen these regressive policies we've seen the regressive policies that bids put forth in other cities. They tend to increase inequality and hasten gentrification. This bid already stands to weaken our local democracy. The way that this is being handled is creating mistrust. With growing interest in rejecting privatization and building back accountable public services, Rochester is actually ahead of the game because we don't have to try and remove a bid like other communities are trying to do. Rochester has only started to address its history of redlining and gentrification. We should not create a new structure that will repeat our past mistakes. I hope that you will join us and help us get this information out to the people that you care about in our community. We want you to have time to advocate in your best interest. If what you've heard today concerns you, council needs to know. They need to know how you feel in order to vote in your best interest before the next vote that goes before council. And next slide, here are their email addresses to reach out to. And I know that was a whole lot and I apologize, but I hope you will stay tuned. And I just want to say thank you so much to Erin and Susanna and to Caitlin and to Darien. You did an incredible job of putting together a really informative and deeply interesting conversation for me. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Well, obviously there's a lot more to talk about, and I do want to just say thank you to all the people who left comments in the Q&A. They're really helpful questions, even those of you who are agnostic or pro-bid. They're really helpful questions and comments. And I see one of the things that comes up is, DC and Portland are not Rochester, and that's true. So, we definitely want to continue the conversation. There are a number of other folks in other cities who we have heard from and reached out to that we hope to be able to do more of these and really draw the lessons before it's too late about what questions we need to be asking and what steps we need to be taking. So before we end, I just want to give our panelists one more go around. Any last thoughts? How can we follow you? How can we find your work? What would you like us to know as we wrap up here? Caitlin, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I guess just to end this, so I can put in the chat just like links to RAP's website, but also we have the End Clean and Safe website, which has more information. But yeah, I think as an ending point is, I think that bids just overall are a very anti-democratic institution. And obviously, like, our focus is mostly on the impacts they have on unhoused people, but really just the way they're set up, they do concentrate power into the hands of few, and they are determining what's happening in public space. And we've seen, even when we've tried to like push back against them, that they've tried to retaliate against us, and that's been a huge issue. But yeah, I just appreciate everyone who's been on the panel today and everything that's been said. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, Caitlin. Really appreciate you as well. Erin, how about you? Where can we read your work? There's quite a few things you've written that are out there. Where should people go to learn more? And what do you want to leave us with here today?
Hi, yeah, so you can find Remora House on Twitter and Instagram. We always respond to messages. You can email us at remorahousedc@gmail.com. Happy to talk more about any of these things. Happy to send you my stuff. I have publications on RAP, blogs. If you Google my name, Aaron Howe, either homelessness or bids, you'll find it. I have a lot of op-eds. I have academic papers. I can send you the links to those. Yeah, so reach out any of those means. I'm always happy to talk. And just my last ending words, I want to say that unfortunately at Remora House, one of the biggest things we do right now is responding to the negative impacts of bids, whether that be a bid throwing away someone's stuff, closing a camp, putting up anti-homeless architecture. That's constantly what we're doing. And I really appreciate the time we've had here, and just want to remind everybody that it's so much easier to stop a bid before it happens than to either react to what they do or get it to go away. So once you start it, it's harder to get rid of it. And it just is going to grow. We started with 2 bids in DC. We now have 11. So yeah, I just want to add that. Really happy to have this opportunity to talk as a group, and really awesome work you're doing in Rochester. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate you as well. And finally, Susanna, where can people read your work, and what do you think is important to leave us with here? From Germany, no less. Thank you. Thank you for taking some time in your sabbatical for us.
No worries. I unfortunately am not on social media, so you can contact me via email. That's on the CUNY website. So if you Google me, you can find me on the CUNY website. What do I want to leave with? I think it's really great to see how much bids have been questioned, and that is, you know, like when we were working in DC in the late 1990s, that wasn't yet the case, and I think they operated probably without people questioning them as an institution and what they actually were and how they were organized and who was sitting on the board. So I think it's really what I'd love to leave people with is just go and research, like Google them, make sure that when you're thinking about bids or organizing a bid, that you're clear on who's going to have the voice on those boards, who's going to actually pay the assessments. So if you are interested in small businesses, and we know that usually these assessments are passed down to them, then you're burdening them already. So these are, you know, it's just bringing them out into the light and asking lots of questions, what they are, how they're organized, what the purpose is. From when I saw your slide, it looks like it's a very similar format to DC, actually, what is being maybe proposed, but you know, just from that slide, I can't. So yeah, so that's, I think, what I would leave it with. Ask lots of questions and peel the layers of the onion, so to speak.
Even if it makes us cry. All right. Well, want to thank you all very much once again. We'll have more of these. If there are specific topics you'd like us to dig into, please let us know. You can go to nobidroc.com to find out the latest and get in touch, subscribe to our newsletter, etc. We're on social media, all that good stuff. So one more time, thank you to all of our panelists, and to Kelly and Tyler for organizing and promoting this, and to all of you who've been watching out there in Zoom land. Have a great afternoon and hope to talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.